here is filling vacuums, trying to make sure we start on time. So someone would love this job.
Hurry up. Yes. Okay, it's with mixed emotions. Can you hear me? No? This way? All right, once again, I still have those mixed emotions standing here, but I'm happy. It's been my privilege for 13 years to chair the Favorite Books program, and now I am absolutely delighted to pass it on to Susan Lee. And in passing it on, I want to read this from Virginia Woolf. And we'll be passing the bookmark. I have sometimes dreamt that when the day of judgment dawns, the Almighty will turn to Peter and will say when he sees us coming with our books under our arms, "Look, these need no reward. We have nothing to give them here. They have loved reading." And that, of course, is Virginia Woolf. So I pass this on to you.
Thank you. I promise to take good care of that. And Erin has been super helpful to me. We're going to keep the format the same for our favorite books, and that is to feel like you can get up and share them. You don't have to have an elaborate presentation. We mostly want to know why you like the book and what it's about. And once again, I'm Susie Lee, and Erin and I are kind of partnering this year as she's teaching me how to do this. So I have a sign-in for you. Our first date is November 28th. So I'm going to pass it around. If you're interested, please sign up. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm switching hats. I volunteered to introduce our speaker this morning. And it's hard to know what to say about Ken. Ken's there's some things I just love about him and things I hate. He reads books. He just reads book after book, and the thing I hate is he remembers every darn thing he read. It just doesn't seem right that someone that old still have these capabilities. Ken and I go way back to the Chemeketen days, and sometime when we're telling stories, we'll tell you about the joint cross-country ski trip that Ken and I led, and nearly everyone was lost and their life was in danger except Ken and I. We knew where we were. Anyway, Ken, when he retired, made a bucket list, and last year when I introduced him, I showed you a picture he took from the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. And so he keeps going down this bucket list and seems to have never-ending energy. He's leaving tomorrow, for it must be on his bucket list. He's going to Nepal, and we won't see Ken until about the 1st of November. I have no idea what this talk is about. I'm very suspicious in that he asked me for a picture of when I was a little boy. And I have this feeling that probably I should tell more in the introduction because he's going to get even with me. So let's welcome Ken Ash.
Thank you, Don. We'll see you later. Okay, without further ado, let's get on to the most important person you never heard of, who is, see if this thing works, not Kitz Haber. Kitz Haber is a mnemonic to help us remember Fritz Haber. Haber was born in 1868 in Breslau, Germany, which is now Wrocław, Poland. And before we go any further, I'd like to ask, anybody knows anything about Fritz Haber that you haven't learned in the last 90 seconds? Show of hands, please. Okay, I see about 4. How about the Haber process? Anybody know about that? I see about 3. Okay, you folks may be excused. Now, for the rest of you, my goal in the next 45 minutes is to convince you that Fritz Haber is as important, based on his effect on civilization, as any of these much better known historical characters, who were, by the way, his contemporaries. But before that, let's get into a little bit of plant physiology. Plants to grow need, by the way, everybody here okay? Plants to grow need sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide from the air. They also need nutrients from the soil. The most important, by volume, is nitrogen. It's also usually the limiting factor. Now, as luck would have it, air is 78% nitrogen, but plants can't use the atmospheric nitrogen because of, whoops. Go back one more. Because of this, technology is wonderful. Because of this strong triple bond, the plants can't break it down. Interestingly enough, carbon dioxide, only 0.04% of the atmosphere, they do need this, I said we'd be seeing him again. This is Don Gallagher. This is little Donnie. And he's here for a reason. And that reason is to make a demonstration. Because when this photograph was taken, the atmospheric carbon dioxide was 0.03%. 100% may not seem like much, but it's been growing at an ever-increasing rate, and it is very important. This is not politics. This is a scientific fact. 97% of the climatologists agree with this. We're at the forefront of drastic climate change. These are some of the things we're going to see down here. Fire season and powerful storms, we got a taste of those this year. Plus, there's some very scary things going on in the ocean with acidification. So I'm getting a little offshore here, but we have a series of politicians. This is not politics, this is science. We have a series of politicians, leaders who have decided to deny fact. And therefore, it falls upon us to do what we can as citizens, as individuals, as members of our state and community to save the world for the little tykes out there now that look like little Donnie. When they're Don's age, we need to do what we can to preserve what's left of our environment. I'm sorry, I just had to take that side trip. Okay, back to nitrogen. There is a nitrogen cycle, and it works something like this. The nitrogen is in the soil in the form of ammonium ions and nitrate ions, taken up by the plant roots, and then two things might happen. The plants will eventually die, decay, the nitrogen will be returned to the soil, or the plants will be eaten. Most of the nitrogen gets returned to the soil in the form of urine, or eventually, when the animal passes away and decays, all back to the soil. With the exception of that which is dissolved and runs off, it ends up eventually in the oceans. This is replaced by nitrogen from volcanic ash, which falls out, and there's some nitrogen fixation in the air, turning gaseous nitrate into ammonia and nitrate ions, and these are endothermic reactions driven by lightning and high energy UV. But most of the nitrogen fixation, over 90% of it, takes place in the soil by bacteria, which are either free living in the soil or on plant nodules. Now, this is the natural cycle. Of course, we changed things a little. We developed agriculture. And that means that the plants are harvested. They're hauled off to some municipality where they are processed, consumed, and the nutrients generally end up being flushed away and usually end up in the ocean. This removes the nutrients from the soil. It's been known for a long time. They called it wearing out the soil. And our forefathers knew about this a long time before they knew what the nutrients were or had names for them. And there were some early, fairly successful attempts to take care of this. For instance, the night soil collection started in China, but it's been very famous everywhere. The first, however, commercial method of putting fertilizer back in the soil turned out to be guano mining. Now, it turns out there are a series of islands off the coast of Peru which are very dry because they're in the rain shadow of the Andes. And the seabirds have been nesting there for millennia. And since these islands are so dry, the guano builds up until it has formed mountains. About 1800, it was discovered that this stuff was excellent fertilizer. And in 1840, they started mining it. This is a worse job than night soil collection. The workers had to be rotated because the fumes would actually kill them within a matter of hours. Running the ships, sailing the ships wasn't much better because besides hauling this odoriferous material, as you can imagine, they only used the oldest ships. Nonetheless, this was a highly successful business, very lucrative. So lucrative that Spain went to war with a combine of South American nations led by Peru over the possession of these islands. Can you believe the shit we'll go to war over? Anyway, by 1880, these deposits, that mountain back there is mostly guano, these deposits had been pretty well depleted. And Peru, getting concerned about the decimation of the seabirds, mostly by the sailors who wanted fresh eggs, shut off the mining. As luck would have it, just slightly before that, nitrate deposits were discovered in what is now Chile. These are in the Atacoma Desert, the driest place on Earth, literally, and not coincidentally, the islands were just offshore, the Atacoma Desert, the islands we were just speaking of. This is the only nitrate deposit that's ever been discovered, and the theory of why it's here is the nutrients, nitrates among them, were leached out of the Andes, ran off in streams which never reached the ocean because it's so dry, and so they're deposited out there in the desert. This turned out to be a highly successful and lucrative business also. So you probably won't be surprised when I tell you that Peru, Bolivia, and Chile went to war over possession of these mines. Chile ended up with most of the mines, but some deposits of potassium nitrate were discovered later in the land that Peru retained. So this is what the substance looks like that came out of the mines. Chemical formula NaNO3. It's also called saltpeter or white gold. And I tell you, it's called that because it was so valuable. People actually went to war over it. This guy is a very famous English scientist. And I put down here some of his attributes so you know that this guy's the real deal. He's not an alarmist or tend to make things up. And it's important you know that because in 1898, Sir William Crookes predicted that millions would starve due to a shortage of nitrogen fertilizer. That gets us back to our hero, Fritz Haber, shown here in his college days. Now, Haber was due to go into the family business, which was dyestuffs. And being an inquisitive and energetic fellow, he convinced his father that anybody in the dye business should know some chemistry. Convinced his father, and he went to a series of universities and attained a PhD in chemistry. As luck would have it, he ended up having some disagreements with Dad and ended up getting out of the business. That's a common story. But if you look up Fritz Haber, you'll find him listed not only as a chemist, but you'll never find him listed as a chemist. He's listed as a brilliant chemist. I don't think I ever saw him listed as just a chemist. It was always brilliant. He had his hand in a great many discoveries and inventions of the time. The most important by far being the Haber process. And here you see, in simplified form, he discovered that if nitrogen, which you can get from the air readily, and hydrogen, which you can manufacture from natural gas, are placed together in the presence of catalyst under pressure and heat, will form a reversible reaction and combine to form ammonia. The second equation just shows us how you can get hydrogen from natural gas, which is mostly methane. It was 1905 when Haber discovered this. By 1909, he decided he'd taken it far enough that he needed a chemical engineer. Enter Karl Bosch, probably the best known chemical engineer in Germany at the time. By the way, I don't think they'd invented the term chemical engineer yet because Bosch is always listed as a chemist and an engineer. But beginning in 1909, they started working on the process. And it looked something like this. In a simplified form, the hydrogen and nitrogen are fed in here to a reactor under pressure and temperature in the presence of a catalyst. An equilibrium is contained where they're combining to form ammonia, and then the ammonia breaks apart to go back. Then the partially reacted gas is fed off through a heat exchanger and into a condenser. The ammonia is condensed out and the gas pumped back to continue reacting. Now, the higher the temperature and the higher the pressure, the faster the reaction goes. But there are prices to pay for that in the form of money to buy energy to heat it and to compress it, and then, of course, safety. Haber and Bosch settled on 400 degrees centigrade and 3,000 psi. And this process went commercial in 1913. You'll notice that's in red. Those are red number, that's red number date. Remember that. Went commercialized. Now, once you have ammonia, very easily converted into ammonium ion, nitrate ion, urea, all of which can be used as fertilizer. Here we see a bag of commercial fertilizer containing 16%, that's what that first 16 indicates, percent nitrogen in the form of, in this one, ammonia and urea. And I want to tell you the Lilly Miller Company is not very forward-looking because they passed up a chance to give me a free bag of fertilizer in return for all the free publicity they're getting here. So, the Haber business, the Haber process turns out to be a very big business. It's creating 450 million tons fertilizer a year. And how important this is? Well, the headlines at the time said the process was producing bread from air. Yeah, newspapers use a little bit of hyperbole. Here's some of the things that were said more seriously. This was called the most important technological invention of the 20th century. Big claim, huh? Now look at this one. It's also called the most significant scientific breakthrough in human history. Well, it used to say that. Part of it got cut off. So is this hyperbole? These are big claims. Well, I'm going to let you decide if the Haber process is all that important, but I'll give you a few facts. Haber won the Nobel Prize 1918 for his process. They don't just give these things away, you know, the Haber. The Nobel Prize Committee is no pushover. Bosch received one for his part in the Haber process in 1931. By the way, you notice 1918 is another red letter date. Remember that, 1918, Haber got his Nobel Prize. So, why did the Nobel Prize Committee give 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry for the same process? Well, because they knew that without the Haber process, the Earth would support 3.5 billion people. For better or for worse, there are currently 7.5 billion of us. Now, let's consider for just a minute how that would have been limited had we not had the Haber process. Starvation, societal breakdown, mass migration toward areas that would have resisted it by force. We'd have had conflict up to and probably including war, possibly cannibalism. I'm not making this stuff up. This has all happened in the past when food got short. So, I hope I've convinced you that Haber is interesting. I hope I've educated you a little. And I hope I've convinced you that Haber is important, as I said I was. But we ain't through yet. The most interesting is yet to come, when I shall magically turn the solution into the problem and the hero into the villain. And now, as Paul Harvey would say, for the rest of the story. Or, paraphrasing Albert Einstein, everything is relative or interrelated. Let's look at a little bit about the Haber process. I told you it was big business. It consumes 1.5% of the total energy that we produce. And it produces 1% of the greenhouse gases that we produce. But it makes nitrogen fertilizer cheaply. How cheaply? Well, here are some of the consequences. Those saltpeter mines in South America were never depleted, although they would have been. But it was cheaper to make it, and one by one they shut down. The last one in 1960. They're setting out there in the Atacoma Desert. They ain't rusting away. They're not decaying away. It's too dry for that. They're just going to sit there. Another consequence, since nitrate fertilizer is so cheap, it's overused. It runs off Here we see the Mississippi drainage, and those green areas are all the areas where the nitrate runs off. It runs down into the Gulf of Mexico, where it fertilizes huge blooms of algae, which die off, and in the process of decaying, deplete all the oxygen, and we get a dead zone. Now there are ways around this. You can calculate how much nitrogen you need with a simple test. This isn't done usually, but it could be. You could put buffer strips of native vegetation along the edge of the streams to cut down on it, but this isn't being done in any great sense yet. So these dead zones grow bigger every year. And this isn't the only one, of course. This is just the one I chose to show you. Every major river's got one. So there's a couple effects of nitrogen fertilizer. Let's take a little stroll through history. World War I, short history of World War I. Began in 1914 when, according to Levinson, Europe's great powers consummated a 4-year murder-suicide pact. He said that because World War I was a war of unprecedented carnage, and the carnage was driven by rapid-fire machine guns, horrific artillery barrages, both powered by, you know the answer, gunpowder. Gunpowder is a mixture of carbon, which comes from charcoal, potassium nitrate, and sulfur. And the potassium nitrate at the time came from Chilean saltpeter mines, which was a problem for Germany in the form of the British Navy, who didn't want them to have the gunpowder. Now, Germany would have run out of nitrate and therefore gunpowder in 1915. They'd had to find a way out of the war. Instead, they converted the Haber process output from munitions, from agriculture to munitions. This is a classic, perhaps the classic case of beating your plowshares into swords. Notice the other red letter date up there, 1915, that's when they would have run out of nitrate, and the Haber-Bosch process went into effect, into production in 1913, cutting it that close. Having a new source of gunpowder, or nitrates, enabled the Germans to fight on until 1918, when they ran out of not gunpowder, but manpower. So the Haber process didn't change the outcome of the war, but it did prolong it, and it increased the casualty count by millions. You notice how easy those terms flow off the tongue? Millions of casualties, millions of deaths. I think it was Stalin who said, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. By 1918, the last year of the war, the German population was reduced to starvation. They're seen here butchering a horse in the streets. The best estimate of how many people died due to starvation ran from the high hundreds of thousands to the low millions. Not entirely starvation, there was malnutrition caused diseases. So, the British get blamed a lot for this situation because their blockade cut off food. Well, there's enough blame to go around. Let's note that Germany itself was the one who diverted the fertilizer to munitions. Anyway, that's the Haber process in World War I. Let's look at Haber. in World War I. Now the fellow there in the military uniform is Fritz Haber. The year is 1917. The occasion is his second marriage. Dapper-looking fellow on the left is his son, Hermann. Now you may wonder, what is a brilliant scientist, 49 years old, with no previous military experience, doing in a uniform? Since you might wonder, I'll tell you. You see, Haber was a German patriot. And as such, he wanted to help his country win the war. So how do you do that if you're a brilliant chemist? Well, he became the father of chemical warfare. And he did this by developing poison gas. And he not only developed the poison gas, but he developed a method of delivery. And further, he convinced the generals, to use it, which wasn't an easy job because A, they didn't consider it chivalrous, and B, there was a little matter of the Hague Convention of 1897, which forbid the use of poison in war. It was ratified in 1907, and Germany was a signator. But by 1915, the war had settled down to a bloody stalemate of trench warfare with no end in sight. So, in April of 1915, Haber, in charge, directed the German military to release 168 million tons of chlorine gas on the Ypres battlefield. It was the Second Battle of Ypres. This is what it looked like from the air as the chlorine drifted over. Paraphrasing Levinson again, the effect was everything Haber had hoped. Hundreds were dead, dying, or comatose. The line broke. The defenders fled in disorder. Probably would have been a military disaster for the Allies, except for two things. One, the German troops, having seen what happened to their enemy, in that particular place, French, Algerians, and Canadians, having seen what happened to them, they were a little reluctant to charge into that deadly green cloud. The other thing is that the German military made the same mistake that the British made with tanks later in that same war. They weren't prepared to follow through. So the Canadians managed to regroup and build a new line a little further on and barely staved off disaster. But it was a victory. They took 2,000 prisoners, Germans did, and captured several hundred artillery pieces. And in recognition of that, Haber was given the title of honorary captain in the German army, of which he was very proud. Here we see him, he's the one pointing, in his uniform, directing a poison gas attack. Besides directing the attacks, whoops, I got one further ahead of myself here. Lost slide here. There it is. Besides directing the attacks, he went on to develop phosgene gas, which was more insidious because you couldn't see it ahead of time. Mustard gas, which would cause painful, debilitating, and even deadly blisters, even if you didn't breathe it. And he developed preparatory preventative measures for the German troops, mostly in the form of gas masks, for the inevitable retaliatory attacks when the Allies reciprocated. Now this is Clara Haber, Fritz's first wife. She was a chemist also, of some renown. The first time Haber proposed to her, she turned him down because she wanted to continue her education. And indeed, she became the first woman in her institution to earn a PhD in chemistry, and one of the very few in Germany. But she found out that as a single woman, she couldn't go very far in her chosen profession. So the second time Haber proposed, she accepted. Could have worked out better for her because she was a feminist, and Haber insisted when Hermann was born that she stay home and take care of him. She tried to continue her career, but by writing and lecturing, but it was assumed that everything she said was from Fritz. She was also a pacifist. She argued against the use of poison gas to no avail, as we have seen. And the night after, shortly after the first attack, the night after Haber received his captaincy, while he was in the parlor being toasted by his friends for his success, Clara took his service revolver, wandered into the garden, shot herself through the heart. She didn't die immediately. She was discovered by Hermann. She died in his arms. He was 13. The next day, Fritz Haber was off to the Eastern Front to direct a gas attack against the Russians. The gas casualties during World War I were 1.25 million. The fatalities, deaths, 91,000. A good many more were debilitated and never really recovered. So, I have been quoting from Levinson. This is the book. It's called The Hunt for Vulcan: How Einstein Destroyed a Planet, Discovered Relativity, and Deciphered the Universe. And this is actually a book about Einstein and relativity, but I'm going to read a section of it to you. We're talking here about the first gas attack in the Battle of Ypres. The effect was everything Haber had hoped for. Hundreds of soldiers were thrown into a comatose or dying position. Such a victory was a fiasco typical of the brutal status that had already gripped the Western Front. Achieving complete surprise, using a weapon for which their enemy had no defense, the Germans gained exactly nothing. The Germans had no reserves available to exploit an advantage they possessed for the briefest of moments. The Western Allies soon retaliated with gas munitions of their own, with no greater tactical success than the Germans. Gas was and remains a terror weapon, ineffective against prepared and similarly armed opponents. Both sides would continue to launch poison attacks throughout the Great War, and Haber himself persisted for years, seeking the one magic formula that would at last deliver a strategic breakthrough rather than just a particularly nasty increment to the misery of trench warfare. He never found it. So let's look at the morality of this a little bit. Here's what Haber said. During peacetime, a scientist belongs to the world, but during war, he belongs to his country. Reasonable, I suppose. He also said, killing enemy troops with gas is no worse than blowing their heads off with artillery. Maybe. This guy would tend to agree. Not known for his compassion and humanity, Der Fuhrer, there in the right-hand picture, decreed during World War II that gas would not be used because as a corporal, seen on the left, he was gassed during World War I. Hitler thought it was too terrible to use. After the war, Haber accepted his Nobel Prize in 1919. You remember he earned it in 1918? Well, in 1918, he was hiding in Switzerland because the United States had declared him a war criminal. After that was lifted, and I don't know why it was, he became director. Actually, he already was. He returned to Germany and resumed his job as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Electrochemistry and Physical Chemistry, and in secret continued work on poison gas for another 5 years. He also tried to pay Germany's very sizable war debt by extracting gold from seawater. It's one of his few failures. He was never able to do that economically. So, he gave his all. He's a German hero, right? Well, something I haven't mentioned. Haber was Jewish. Well, at least initially. Now, early in his career, he converted to be a Lutheran, and he became quite an enthusiastic Lutheran. Most folks think to further his career. And it worked until these folks came to power. In 1933, at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where Fritz Haber was the director, a porter showed up with a sign stating, "The Jew Haber is not welcome." A little later in the year, Haber was directed to fire all the Jews on his staff. Well, we already know he's a smart guy. He saw the handwriting on the wall. He knew he wouldn't be far behind. He fled Germany in 1933, a broken man. He went first to England, where the scientific community shunned him because of his work on gases in World War I, excuse me. He then left England and died in Switzerland just months later of a heart attack. Perhaps a broken heart, who knows? So let's look at Haber's legacy. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was renamed for him in 1953. However, contemporary German students consider him a murderer. Yeah, I know, I misspelled it. So we could discuss this and all its ramifications and look at the pressures on him at the time and what happens during wartime, or we could take a cheap shot. Let's take the cheap shot. Dr. Haber on the left, Dr. Evil is portrayed by Mike Myers on the right. Oh, one final irony. Haber invented an insecticide, developed an insecticide called Zyklon. It was slightly modified later and called Zyklon B. It was used in the Nazi gas chambers to kill millions, most of them Jews, some of them Haber's nieces and nephews, and a sister-in-law. In happier times, there's Fritz with his friend Albert. I think you probably all recognize him. And I'm going to quote again here from Levinson. Einstein never reconciled himself to the shock of war, not merely the fact of battle, but the naked joy everyone, it seemed, took in the fight. What was worse, in Einstein's eyes, was that the extraordinary collection of scientific minds that had lured him to Berlin turned out to be as war drunk as any mob in the street. The most potent symbol of this almost personal betrayal was Einstein's closest Berlin friend, Fritz Haber, who would later win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. So what did these two guys have in common? Haber and Einstein. Well, they were both German. They were both Jewish, sort of. They were both brilliant scientists, and they both made their seminal discoveries in 1905. Einstein's was, of course, the theory of relativity. And what do we owe to the theory of relativity? Well, our understanding of gravity, our ability to accurately direct spacecraft, and the GPS, Global Positioning System. So what do you personally owe to Haber and his process? 50% of the nitrogen in your body. Now, I was prepared to go on a little longer because I thought I was going to have an hour and a half, so I'm just going to run through a couple of these things here. I would have normally asked if you thought that Haber, based on his effect on society, on current civilization, really belongs in this group, all of which were his contemporaries. Is he really that important? I think so. How about you? We could have discussed duality of science for good or evil. Well, I've hit the evil side. I'd be ready to argue the other side. And this two picture clearly shows the duality as personalized by Fritz Haber. Poison gas and agricultural abundance. And we could discuss morality if you wanted, because it turns out that morality is not a simple matter of black and white, and neither is Fritz Haber. So, questions? Oh. By the way, this book, Thomas Levinson, The Hunt for Vulcan, I'm going to recommend this book very highly to anybody who likes science, who likes history, who likes the history of science. I'm going to lay it right here. You may put your name on the flyleaf and you may pass it around. Enjoy. Questions? Yo.
I seem to recall that Haber was also engaged in dyes. Did he not have some work, some discoveries in dyes?
Yeah, I don't really know that. I know that he originally, Haber's business was dye stuffs, and he had his hand in a great many things, which I didn't research, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if some of them weren't dyes, particularly since that was one of the big chemical searches at the time was dye stuffs.
This is Carmen, and I was noticing recently that some old blue cheese had an ammonia smell. Is that just from being old, or is there some process that occurs when, until you have to throw it out? So it was blue cheese.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed part of that.
The blue cheese that we had that was in our refrigerator had an ammonia smell. And I threw it out, but I have smelled that before, so always have fresh blue cheese, but wondered what caused that. Is it just the age, and it's like anything else that's dying, or?
Yeah, it's aging and breaking down, and that's probably part of the ammonia, part of the nitrogen in the blue cheese being converted to ammonia. So exactly what you smell is probably ammonia.
This is Lester. Part of this was depicted in that series by National Geographic called Einstein, and it follows very closely your explanation of events, particularly the decision to support the war effort. But one of the legacies, I think, we have to remember is that the non-point pollution that you mentioned that occurs for the high use of nitrogen as fertilizers and its destruction in the Gulf and other areas.
Yeah.
Jinx, over here. an interesting little article on NPR a while back was talking about the chlorine in pools combined with particularly small children peeing in them, and that the ammonia from their urine would actually create mustard gas. So the next time you get in a public pool, you might want to be thinking about that. I do believe that Haber was a part of the development of dyes in the 19th century. An interesting book called Mauve was about the British man who discovered by accident the mauve dye, which was apparently the first chemically produced non-plant dye. And the interesting part to me was that in Britain, if a scientific discovery didn't have an economic payoff, the Brits weren't as interested in that kind of thing, whereas the Germans were, and they gave more credence and support to their scientific community than the British did. And I wonder if that isn't why Haber ended up making a bigger impact, perhaps, than, I don't know, the guy who came up with mauve.
That's quite possible. And you're right about research not necessarily directed toward a product, and quite often it does end up of great importance economically and otherwise. A good many developments started off not looking for a product, and I personally believe that we in this country are missing the boat by cutting back on general research.
Well, we've run out of time, Ken. We gave Ken an opportunity to have 90 minutes later in the term, or 45 minutes here before he left on his trip. And you did a great job of condensing that. And I'm anxious to know what your next project's going to be on. I'm sure you'll be thinking about it as you trek in Nepal. So thank you, Ken, and thank you all of you for cooperating.